Ramanujan was, of course, a great source of inspiration for subsequent generations of mathematicians in this country. But people do not quite know what his milieu was like at the time when he embarked on mathematics. It is true that he had no access to advanced mathematics in terms of either good books or in terms of teachers of renown. He failed in his, as everybody knows, he failed in his so-called FA examinations, and therefore was not exposed to mathematics at a more advanced level, which is available in India at that time at the graduate level. However, it must be said that the milieu was not entirely alien to mathematics. I mean, there were mathematicians in the country who knew what was going on in the world at large, not just Cambridge and England, even what's going on in Europe. For example, a paper appearing in the 1913 or 14 issue, one of the early issues of the journal The Indian Mathematical Society, by P.V. Seshwaiyer, who wrote a short biography of Ramanujan later with Ramachandra Rao, talks about the work of Poincare. Poincare lived into the 20th century, and it's remarkable that people in India were abreast of what was going on in the world at large, not merely England, but Europe. So it was not as if India, the intellectual leadership in India did not know about many of the advances in mathematics, but of course nobody had performed at the same creative level as Ramanujan. There were some mathematicians who were already were known internationally. For instance, there was the mathematician by name who's not very well known, Shamadas Mukhopadhyay, and there is the so-called four-vertex theorem of Shamadas Mukhopadhyay, which is quite well known among differential geometers. It was one of the early works in differential geometry to emerge from this country. And even before him, there were some mathematicians who were known internationally and had done some interesting work. There was this man by name Ganesh Prasad, who actually went to England and tried to publish some of his work in the English journals, but did not succeed. However, on his way back to India in Germany, he spent some time. Sommerfeld actually solicited his paper and published it in a German journal. So the situation was that there was something going on in India, something worthwhile, but of course Ramanujan broke a new path in the sense that he published things at a much more advanced level. And as is well known, he was not able to secure a position for himself in mathematics, mainly because he did not have a degree. And this is often, there's often criticism about our examination system and things of that kind, because it failed to give some chance for a person like Ramanujan to pursue mathematics. However, I don't think this criticism is quite justified. There are always mavericks who will not fit into any system of evaluation, and so it's extremely difficult to cater to them. For example, in the French system, which is supposed to be very good and so on, Galois could not secure admission to the École Polytechnique. He was a weird person in many ways. I mean, very, very different from the ordinary youngster, even ordinary, very bright youngsters. He was very unusual, and it was not surprising that École Polytechnique could not see his great talent. So it's not quite correct to say that things were not right for Ramanujan in this country, the whole system was wrong and so on. It's true, the system has defects which continue to this day, but you cannot say, no, these things will happen however good your system is. There will be people who will not be recognized by the system. That said, anyway, Ramanujan was, in some ways, the Ramanujan story, it ends tragically, no doubt, but it's more like it's really like a fairy tale with no witches. Everyone he came across, practically everyone he came across, was very helpful to him. Of course, they did not have the wherewithal to support him to the extent he needed to be supported, most of them, but they did support him to the extent possible. For instance, Ramachandra Rao paid out his own money to support him for almost more than a year. when he moved to Port Trust, and even when he went to Port Trust, Ramchandra Rao wrote a strong letter to the chairman of the Port Trust suggesting that he should let Ramanujan free to do mathematics even at the cost of the work of the Port Trust. And amazingly, the chairman of the Port Trust, a man by the name Francis Spring, did exactly that, allowed Ramanujan to work at his mathematics without disturbance and not bothering about his not delivering on what he was supposed to do in the Port Trust. So altogether, the people we came across in India were really helpful to him. And the point is that, of course, they could not fit him into we could get him a position as a researcher in the university. That happened only after the intervention of Hardy. And it was fortunate that he came into contact with Hardy. He wrote this famous letter to Hardy, which had consequences, which eventually made him world famous. Well, Ramanujan's stint in Cambridge was very productive. He published a large number of papers. But one must say that Ramanujan was, in mathematics there are two different kinds of mathematicians, if you like. There are people who build theories, and their main aim is not to solve any particular problem, but to have a framework in which many problems can be solved. Ramanujan didn't quite belong to that category. He picked up arbitrary questions and worked on them, but did not evolve a theory which will subsume every possible problem within a whole range. For example, take someone like Galois. His theory is something which led to solutions of large number of problems. He himself attacked a certain problem, but with great scope. What the question he asked was how to determine whether a given polynomial equation can be solved by so-called radicals. That's the problem he was looking at in general. And he proposed a general theory which gave a complete answer to the question. Of course, he was inspired by that problem, but the theory itself has many more ramifications and is actually the foundation of all modern number theory. Ramanujan's work is very much into number theory, but he did not build any theory of the kind like Galois theory, for instance. On the other hand, he developed certain techniques and methods which have proved very fruitful over the years, long after his own lifetime. For example, the so-called Hardy little circle method, which really goes back to Ramanujan and Hardy, is a technique for solving many different problems in number theory, which are useful to this date. And there are young mathematicians in India who have further sharpened those techniques and proved nice theorems in number theory. The other thing which is of great importance, which Ramanujan did, is related to what are called modular forms. It's not clear if Ramanujan himself was aware of what really modular forms are. It's not very clear that he was aware of Galois theory, for instance. Galois theory can be related to modular forms, and that is because of more recent developments. In the last 50 years, there have been tremendous development which links Galois theory with other things, with modular forms in particular. But Ramanujan himself may not have had any ideas because his background in mathematics was not very strong. He had not learned many different things. Many things, it's not even clear to me that whether he was aware of Galois theory. I don't know, I'm not an expert on Ramanujan, but as far as I know, he doesn't seem to have had exposure to Galois theory. Of course, he has inspired many mathematicians, but notable among them is the great mathematician Selberg. Selberg has contributed greatly to number theory, in particular to the theory of modular forms. What is known as Selberg-Trace formula is one of the most important developments in the 20th century number theory. And he says in one of his, he said in one of his lectures, which is actually reproduced as an article in a book edited by Bruce Burnt, that he was greatly inspired by Ramanujan. His father presented him with a copy of Ramanujan's collected works when he was 16 or 17 and so on, and that inspired him greatly is what he says. He himself worked a great deal on things like modular forms, and he also makes an interesting comment in that article, in that lecture. There was a great mathematician by the name Hecke in Germany, who was actually born the same year as Ramanujan, who did a lot of work on modular forms. And Selberg speculates on what could have happened if Ramanujan had contact with Selberg. He probably would have developed into a much greater figure than he did with the help of Hardy. In fact, there are comments to the effect that Hardy was, while he did a lot of good for Ramanujan and developed his mathematics considerably, with this, and Ramanujan developed his mathematics considerably with his help, Ramanujan could have done better with more contacts with European counterparts rather than British. In fact, there is a very pithy comment by the great mathematician Andre Weil. I mean, it's Andre Weil always liked to make sharp comments, and he said on one occasion that it's a pity that Ramanujan did not have exposure to European mathematicians. Hardy, in fact, spoilt a lot of Indian mathematicians, but Ramanujan was too great for him to spoil. That is the comment. It should be taken with a pinch of salt, of course. On the other hand, there is an element of truth in it that British mathematicians were not pursuing mathematics which was really exciting as was being done by European mathematicians. It is France and Germany, not Cambridge, which is the center for pure mathematics and number theory in particular. Britain was more inclined towards applied mathematics. Hardy was the only exception who did a lot of pure mathematics. But he also was not, I mean, for example, his number theory was of a rather special kind, in which Ramanujan also got in. So it's speculative, of course, it's all speculation, one cannot say very much. So apart from the circle method and modular forms, where Ramanujan's contributions were probably not conscious contributions to the theory of modular forms per se, but has a lot to do with it. And he introduced what he called the tau function, which is turned out to be the central theme in the theory of modular forms, at least in its early stages. The tau function is closely connected with what is known as moduli of elliptic curves, which plays a very great and important role in number theory. The third theme in Ramanujan's work is about special functions and identities among them. This is the area which probably has been followed up by a very large number of Indian mathematicians as well as well-known figures from abroad. The three names which come to mind every time one speaks of Ramanujan these days are Andrews, Berndt and Askey. And these people have largely worked on things related to Ramanujan identities. Turns out some of these identities also have to do with modular forms as well. There is probably a common theme to all of his work, but it's not clear that Ramanujan was aware of it, or, I mean, what I mean is that he may have had an intuitive perception of the commonness among all these themes, but never put it down clearly as a theoretical framework for his work. And towards the end of his life, he worked on these mock theta functions, which also seem to have a lot to do with modular forms, as has been discovered relatively recently. So, post-Ramanujan, what's been happening to Indian mathematics? Ramanujan, as I said, is a great source of inspiration, but people did not necessarily go into the area in which he worked, which was largely number theory and related topics. In fact, the one person who really went into number theory seriously soon after Ramanujan, that is actually, I should say, 20 or 30 years after Ramanujan, was S. Pillai. Pillai worked on what is known as the varying problem. I don't think Ramanujan had paid any attention to the varying problem, and he solved an outstanding open question which brought him international fame. Pillai, however, died young. In fact, he died in an air crash on his way to his first visit to the United States. It's a very unfortunate happening. He died at the early age of 51 or 52, something of that kind. There are other mathematicians who did work of importance, not of course not in the same league as Ramanujan, but work which is recognized abroad as important, as well as in the mathematical community at large as recognized as important, and some of it is currently still of interest. To name some people, mainly from Chennai, in those days, Madras of course, Anand Rao was a first-rate Indian mathematician who was actually a student of Hardy and worked on questions which Hardy raised, which summability of infinite series was the main theme of many of Andhra's work. So Hardy himself had a book called Divergence Series, which is a standard text in those days for researchers working in this area. Then Andhra had a number of students. Among them should be mentioned Vijay Raghavan, who was a number theory analyst, who also did very nice work in number theory. His name is preserved in mathematical literature because of some objects named as Piso Vijay Raghavan numbers, for instance. Then there was, a little later, there was this man, Meenakshi Sundaram, who did beautiful work in analysis, far removed from Ramanujan's own interests. He also worked in summability, and his work became important later on in one approach to what is known as Atiyah-Singer index theorem, which is probably one of the greatest theorems of the 20th century. And Meenakshi Sundaram's techniques were employed by another Indian mathematician named Patodi to solve the Atiyah-Singer index, to prove the Atiyah-Singer index theorem with a new proof which involved the heat equation. Heat equation is what Meenakshi Sundaram worked on. And then in the north, there were mathematicians such as Chawla, who was an excellent number theorist. Many of them, I'm sure, were inspired by the story of Ramanujan, though most of them did not, the better known ones, did not work exactly in Ramanujan's area. Perhaps the greatest mathematician to emerge from India was, after Ramanujan, was Harishchandra. Harishchandra's work is in what is known as representation theory of Lie groups, and it certainly did not start off with anything which Ramanujan was interested in, but there was eventually some kind of connection between Harishchandra's work and Ramanujan's work through modular forms. Harishchandra worked on representation theory, which plays an important role in the theory of modular forms, and the start of modular forms is with Ramanujan's work on the so-called toe function. So there is some link of Ramanujan with later developments at the forefront of mathematics. Harishchandra's work stays at the forefront. He is one of the greats of the 20th century after Ramanujan, to emerge from India after Ramanujan. And both Ramanujan and Harishchandra, of course, are great by any measure internationally. So these are some of the people who have done very well after Ramanujan. And the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research had a number of very good mathematicians who performed at a very superior level, who have all, once again, most of them have not worked in areas connected to Ramanujan, but their source for their inspiration was certainly Ramanujan. I will mention some names. C.P. Ramanujam, he spelled his name with an M at the end, was one of our finest young algebraic geometers who unfortunately died at a very young age. He passed away at the age of 32 or 33, I forget, or maybe a little more, 34. I mentioned Patodi already. He was also a youngster who also died young. He died at the age of 31, before which he had proved very beautiful theorems. Then there are other mathematicians, some of them, another mathematician who passed away of great stature was Sri Shankar Abhyakar, a Maharashtrian, who spent most of his time, however, abroad, like Harishchandra. Both Abhyakar and Harishchandra worked largely abroad, whereas Ramanujan and Patodi worked at the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research. Other mathematicians who worked at the Tata Institute, who should be mentioned, are M.S. Narasimhan and C.S. Seshadri. Then there's another famous name, internationally famous name, from India, Varadan, who again worked mostly abroad. These are some of the big names I mentioned. India has a large body of very competent, very good mathematicians who have not, I have not mentioned names, but they may not be in the same league as M.S. Narasimhan and C.S. Seshadri, whom I mentioned, but they are pretty good. The only unfortunate thing is that the really outstanding mathematicians to emerge from India have all emerged from a handful of institutions, 3 or 4, while the large community of mathematicians all over the country in different universities have not quite measured up to high standards that one expects to emerge from this country. especially in the context of our ancient achievements in mathematics. So much about mathematics after Ramanujan in India. Well, but one of the important things that one should, the only way forward if you want to really become an outstanding mathematical community, who can hold their own in the world for this country, is for a large number of youngsters to pursue mathematics. Doesn't seem to be an attractive option at the moment for many youngsters. There are a number of opportunities for them to hone their mathematical skills are not very good. There are a handful of good institutions which are very selective in the way they recruit students, and even it is on the card that many good students don't get selected to these places because this country has not yet achieved what it should be able to achieve to become one of the leading countries in the world in mathematics. And this can be achieved only if many more youngsters, talented youngsters, take to mathematics, which is not happening now. There are many reasons why it's not happening. In the first place, mathematics as a profession is not attractive to many youngsters, or more importantly, for their parents, who discourage them from going into training in mathematics for that reason. There's a second problem is that even if a person wants to get into mathematics, it's not clear where he can get the required training. There are only about half a dozen institutions in this country where mathematics students are trained properly. Elsewhere, unfortunately, the training is not very satisfactory. Most of our universities, the PhD programs are highly unsatisfactory. So, in this context, it's not clear how we can develop into the mathematically developed nation that we aspire to be. Fortunately, there are a number of institutions which are coming up slowly. The new ISAs, for instance, are good places where you can get reasonably good mathematics training, and that is a very good development. I hope in the coming 5 or 6 years, the number of institutions which offer you will go from the present 5 or 6 to about 20. This, if it happens, augurs well for our future. There is another possibility which students should be aware of. The internet offers lots of courses in mathematics, in fact, from very well-known American universities, which, if you are able to follow, will be excellent. Books, of course, are also available, but the internet is a great source these days because books are expensive, internet is less expensive. So these are possibilities for youngsters, but one thing youngsters have to bear in mind, they should try to pursue mathematics only if they find it interesting, and even more importantly, only if they are capable of hard work. Many people often think that they are talented, and others also agree that they are talented, but they miss one point. Real talent includes a capacity for hard work. If you do not have capacity for hard work, you should not consider yourself talented. It's often said that genius is 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration, something of that kind. There's a lot of truth in it. There's no question about it. On the other hand, of course, it's also true that some people are more gifted than others. They probably have to work less hard than others to understand a lot more mathematics. It does happen, but once you have capacity for hard work, it does not matter. Your achievement will depend very much on the extent of hard work you put in. Of course, the inspiration is important. It's not you cannot do without it, but it's not everything. There are instances of people who have achieved a great deal without so-called the component of inspiration being not that great. There are lots of, in the history of mathematics, you can find many people like that. So that is that's all about what I want to say in the context of the National Mathematics Day. This is an occasion to remember Ramanujan, of course, and what he has done for Indian mathematics. My own experience is not quite typical of most mathematicians. my interest in mathematics developed relatively late. I mean, I was always interested in mathematics, but equally so in several different things. I was equally fascinated by physics, history, anything you like. In school, I did not have any special attachment to mathematics over other subjects. All subjects I liked, in particular mathematics without question. And this continued into college, and in fact, in college I went into mathematics not so much because I was all that keen on it, as because of the fact that I couldn't get into physics. My performance in my school examinations were not sufficiently good for me to secure admission in hot subjects of those days, like physics. So I ended up in mathematics, which is only my second choice, so to speak. However, after I joined, of course, I enjoyed mathematics, there's no question about it. And and in fact, I did not take it too seriously till my second year, or even at college, when I discovered that there are large parts which I had neglected and not understood, and that came as a shock to me because I always fancied myself as a good student. And then I learned what hard work is. I started working hard at that point. But even then, it was not up to the mark, so to speak. I learned to do some hard work, but did it sporadically. And after I finished my degree, again I was toying with whether I should try to do physics after my master's degree, or whether I should continue with mathematics and so on. And since there were many options, I had applied to various things, and I ended up at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, which fortunately gave me admission. And it is there that I slowly developed a greater interest in mathematics and really become hooked on mathematics, so to speak. And it is there that I learned what real hard work is. An example was set by my senior students there. I found that all of them were very bright young people, and they worked very hard. And to be able to hold my own with them, I had no choice but to work hard. That's how I learned to work hard. Unfortunately, in the current situation, our undergraduates are not encouraged to work hard. I mean, their curriculum is usually a little too easy for them to need hard work to live up to it, and there are too many distractions. This was not the case nowadays. We didn't have the kind of distractions which internet offers, but these days it's much more difficult, therefore, for students, even if they're interested, to concentrate on mathematics and appreciate the need for hard work. But on the other hand, the field itself has become extremely competitive, and unless you have a great capacity of hard work, it's not a career in which you can succeed if you choose to take that career. And these days, on the other hand, it's also true that if you pursue mathematics, academics is not the only career open to you. There are other possibilities, which also makes it attractive to people, your parents or guardians, who would want you to pursue studies which will lead to a good job and things of that kind. However, if at the end of your studies, graduate studies, you will find you're still attracted to mathematics. There are fortunately more opportunities available than used to be the case in the old days. And of course, in the old days, even opportunities abroad were minimal, but these days there are lots of opportunities abroad. Which can, so long as if you want to pursue mathematics, well, there are also opportunities abroad, which you can use, especially in the case you are not able to get into one of the good institutions in this country. Well, that's the kind of advice, or whatever you call it, that I can give youngsters. Of interest in mathematics is Lie groups. This is an area which developed relatively recently. Lie groups are named after a Norwegian mathematician by name Sophus Lie, who lived around the turn of the last century. So it's quite, the subject developed from then, from his work, and so that's why it's known as Lie theory, named after him. And it's, as I said, it began at the turn of the century, and by about the middle of the century, it was reasonably well understood. There is the structure theory of Lie groups, which is understood very well. Lie groups are at once groups, they are also spaces on which you can talk of continuity and so on. So it's an object which incorporates group theory, which is essentially an algebra subject, and also includes continuity, which is comes from analysis. And together they, in fact, actually Lie groups is often considered a part of geometry, because Lie group serves to explain many geometries, so to speak. Anyway, the subject had developed considerably well by the middle of the last century, but still there were many open questions. But the attention turned to what are known as discrete subgroups of Lie groups. That is, abstract groups, finite generate abstract groups which sit inside Lie groups as the topology induced being discrete. Well, I'm probably getting too technical, can't help it. Anyway, so my interest is more specific. It's interest in discrete subgroups of Lie groups. For example, an example of a Lie group is the group called non-singular n-cross-n matrices over real numbers. It's a group in its own right under multiplication. It is also, it says open set in Euclidean L space, so you can do a lot of analysis on that, for example. And inside that sit integral matrices which are invertible. Matrices with integral entries whose determinant is plus or minus 1. Obviously this sits as a discrete subgroup. It's groups like this that interest me, and it's not surprising that it should be connected with number theory. In fact, in the last 50 years, much of the development in Lie group theory is connected with number theory. And one of the famous names who started off this connection is Langlands. His program is one of the important developments of the 20th century. My own work is not exactly related to Langlands, but it has some kind of vague association with Langlands' program, so to speak. Well, Lie theory itself has been applied to physics, especially the kind of work that Harishchandra did has relevance to physics. Representation theory, as it's called, is relevant to physics. In fact, representation theory of Lie groups developed as a consequence of the needs of physics. The physicists were very much interested in so-called infinite dimensional representations of the Lorentz group, which plays an important role in physics, especially in quantum mechanics and relativity. And because of that, they got interested in representations of that so-called Lorentz group, and Lorentz group is a very special Lie group, which is why the beginnings of representation theory of Lie groups starts in physics. Lie groups, the discrete subgroups of Lie groups have also found some applications in, well, group theory itself has found some applications in crystallography, and also in some other areas which has to do with fractals. But I won't go into it. I don't know very much about it, so I won't go into it. My own work doesn't seem to have any connection with applications. It's closely related to number theory, but that is it. That's all one can say. I don't know, it's very difficult, the connection between mathematics and spiritualism or whatever you call it. I am personally not a believer in God. But on the other hand, there are many mathematicians who do believe, and some of them do say that their inspiration comes from God. There is always a certain, what is inspiration? It's not clear what inspiration means. I mean, if something suddenly comes to you, and you don't know what its source is, you tend to call it God. Some people do that. I don't do it. I also have the experience of suddenly coming into my mind without my ever anticipating it, that I would ever come to that kind of get that kind of idea. It has happened to me, and it has happened to many mathematicians. Some of them have, there is, for instance, Poincaré talks about how he suddenly got an idea when he was about to get into a bus. He doesn't talk about God. But it is a sudden thing, and he had been for struggling with it for many years, then gave it up, forgot all about it, and suddenly when he got into this bus, he gets his idea. So, I mean, you call it whatever you like, it's God or very special intuition, whatever you want to call it. It does exist. Some, if you like, some mathematicians prefer to think of it as being, to think of themselves as being inspired by God. Others don't. Ramanujan himself is not very clear that he always held that view. According to Hardy, he did not, but according to others, he did have this feeling that the goddess Namagiri has blessed him. Call it what you will. I mean, it's some kind of gift. Where it comes from, one doesn't know. Call it God, okay, it's up to you. Call it nature, it's up to you. That's all I can say.